Anderson, and I'm an equity avenger. I'm going to say it again. I'm an equity avenger. All right. I became an equity avenger after the death of George Floyd. And at that time, I was on active duty in the Air Force. I was a captain. And I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond in this moment? So I did what every young, energetic captain does, or a young, energetic NCO. Hey, I was a former NCO. Okay. Come on now, Air Force. I wrote an article. I wrote an op-ed in military.com. And in that article, I talked about how the Air Force can risk missing its moment to make lasting and systemic change in the Air Force. And I did what folks told me not to do, y'all. After I wrote it, I read the comments. Don't read the comments. Richard, we know. Don't read the comments, right? Can't do that. And in those comments, I learned that there were two things that stuck out to me. Some folks called me dumb. Some folks said, he's just woke. I had someone also tell me to go do my job, which I thought I was doing pretty well as an intel officer. But the thing that really stuck out was that the broader community, the military community, the veteran community, didn't even know what the difference between inequity and inequality were. Had no idea. And so when I think about the impact of a Black Veterans Project, I think about creating the next generation of equity avengers. I think about folks like Richard. I think about others who are distinguished guests here in the crowd who I know are doing their work each and every day to advance racial equity in the veteran community, in the military family community, caregiver, survivor community, and most importantly, as it pertains today, to advance racial equity and equity in the Black veteran community. So it's my honor to open up today and welcome you all to this inaugural. Let's also give a hand clap for the inaugural part. Woo! This is the first of many equity receptions. This is a time for us to come together, figure out how to collaborate, hear from amazing voices like Claradith and others, and figure out how we can make change in this community that outlasts and outlives us. So with that, I was told to keep the remarks tight and the opening tight. So I'm going to do that. And it is my honor to welcome the CEO of Black Veterans Project, Richard Brookshire. Let's give a hand clap. Wait. Right here. And to introduce Daniel Walker, right? Who's an Air Force veteran. Go Air Force. Army veteran too, I'm sorry. But Air Force veteran and BVP board member to the stage to walk through the series and the sequence of events today. Again, we are so excited to have you here with us. Over to you.
Thank you. Come on. First, I just want to say that this is our first event here in DC, and so to have this kind of turnout is great. And I want to thank Cherie Dunbar for all that she's done in the last few months to help to orient this organization, and this event would not have been possible without her steadfast leadership and her persistence around making sure that we were putting an event and bringing community together to talk about our work. And so my name is Richard Brookshire. I am the co-founder of Black Veterans Project. I want to first, before we get into our conversation, recognize our board members, my other co-founder, Danielle Anderson, who's in the audience, our board members, Mary Tobin, Daniel Walker, Ravi Perry, Zella Vanny, who's not here, and Kyle Bibby as well, and of course, Cherie Dunbar. So give a round of applause for our board. And so this is a brief conversation between Daniel and I, but I wanted to take a moment to walk you through what the last 6 years have looked like, very, very briefly. I was a combat medic in the Army, and I got out in 2016 and had a really, really difficult transition. And I found myself part of a generational struggle to get access to veterans benefits that I had earned. And unfortunately, my struggle led me to a suicide attempt. And when I had that attempt, this project was seeded with a prayer. When I was in the psych ward, I prayed for guidance, for my life that I was going to continue because I had survived, for a project that would, or a calling that would be worth the rest of my days, but also a sense of purpose and direction. And the heavens, really, because it really has not been me, has helped to guide the hand of this project, has helped to guide the hand of the folks who have now come into this room, and the folks who have interfaced with this work, because this work is about the Black vets who've come before us. It is not about any individual, and certainly I hope what you take most away from this conversation today is that equity is about all of us, and we all have a real role to play in making sure that the future is made sound, but also that there is a reckoning that takes place for the past that has been brought upon the community from which we come from. And so about 6 years ago, when this work started with a small band of Black vets who were themselves trying to find their ways in the world and trying to make adjustments, we started a research partnership with Yale Law School. And I always shout out Yale because if it wasn't for that partnership, much of this work would not have been possible. And we sat for months and months, Daniel Anderson and another veteran named Christina Brown Fisher, who is a remarkable journalist, and we organized to orient FOIA requests to look at as much data as we possibly could relating to racial disparities in disability compensation. And we wanted to leverage that data, one, to get a good sense of where the disparities stood, because the VA had actually never shared externally internal race-based data before. Even though vets had been asking for it for decades, it took the coordination of our project following the death of George Floyd and the political and media momentum that we were able to garner because of working with Yale Law School, where we were for the first time in history able to make that data public. And it confirmed what many Black vets had long suspected, that there were in fact systemic and sustained racial disparities, right? And so that case, we've now been able to build a legal case with Yale around a veteran named Conley Monk. And I like to very briefly tell his story. Conley is a Vietnam era vet. Volunteered to go to Vietnam, came from New Haven, came from a military family at the height of the Vietnam War when folks were dodging drafts. Conley decided that he would go to Vietnam. And he went there, he served 2 gruesome tours as a Marine, saw untold levels of carnage. And at the end of his second tour, he got into an altercation with a white superior who called him a racial epithet. And he found himself, like tens of thousands of other Black vets at the time, on the other side of a dishonorable discharge. And he had to fight for 40 years to get access to basic health care from the VA. He had to fight for 40 years to be able to get a VA home loan so that he could get a pathway to the middle class, like many of the other vets who had served alongside him had. And that continued as part of a legacy that this country has engaged in locking Black vets out of the economic opportunities that come with access to veterans benefits. And so Yale built this case. Conley is the first litigant, and he's also suing on behalf of his deceased father, because our work really starts around World War II. And his father came back from World War II and didn't get access to the GI Bill. And so at the heart of this work is building out legal strategies, which I'm now going to bring in my dear friend and brother who I've had the opportunity to be in this struggle with, but also building the vision of BVP with for the last year. I came across Daniel a few years ago after he was exiting the Air Force as a fighter pilot. And I saw him on 60 Minutes, and I was like, I got to know this brother. I got to know who he is. And we connected, and he found his way to Harvard Law School and has now helped to catapult some of this legal work into another stratosphere. And so I'll let him introduce himself some more and what brings him to the work and some of the legal work that we plan to do.
First, thank you everyone for spending some time with us today and sharing in this vision, this weight, and in this struggle together. Whether it's trauma bonding or any other sense of community, for all of us to be together and sharing this experience makes it more palatable, makes it more livable. It means that all of us can get through the end of this with some sort of sense of togetherness and health. I also want to thank everyone who's already laid the groundwork at BVP that Richard's already mentioned, and understand that everything that I've done or will do in the future is because that foundation has already been laid. And with that in mind, when we talk about equity, if the foundation of the environment that we all exist in is to be one built on exclusion, hoarding, and extraction, equity and inclusion is not a nice to have, it is a battle. It is a fight. And so we are trying to recover the ideals of what it is that this country was founded upon, to include those of us who have spent generations building what it is that this nation is today. And so my history is that of a Texan, where I was born and raised. I went to the Air Force Academy. I graduated from there, and I flew fighter jets for 12 years after that. So I spent most of my adult life as a warrior for this country. As did my great uncle, as did my grandfather, but unlike the generations that came before me, I got the benefits I felt I deserved and was due after I sacrificed for the safety and security of my country. And having received those benefits, I know that differentiation between getting what you deserve and not getting what you deserve is that of a life-changing magnitude. My trajectory, my comfort, and my capabilities are much different than my grandfather's, who died in poverty. Much different than the struggles of my mother, who sacrificed much to get me where I am today, whereas she should have been able to pass something down to me. And so when I meet arguments that the harms of the past that African Americans and others in this country have suffered do not equate to present harm, I meet that and I say, that's invalid because I've lived it and I've seen it. And so the work of the Black Veterans Project, whether it be litigation, legislation, social impact, is not only founded on repair and recovering what has been lost in the past, but securing what it is that we get in the future. So when we talk about litigation is about taking a moral case into the halls of some court, in front of some judge or possibly a jury, and arguing that the harm that has been levied upon you is due some sort of restitution, damage, or otherwise. And the case for African Americans is broad. The case for every other ethnic group that has suffered harm is broad. The case for veterans that have suffered harms is broad. It's deep, but the work is worthwhile. Veterans that return from warfare and we get nothing, veterans that return from warfare and that are harmed mentally and physically and get nothing should get what they are due. This not only requires walking into a courthouse and making these arguments, but it also requires political will. It requires walking the streets of D.C. It requires lobbying congressmen, senators, and otherwise to say, this isn't just an immoral case. This is a case of finance. This is a case of equality. This is a case of what happens to these people in the future and their children. So what we've done is we've taken the Monk case. We said, how else can this be extrapolated in the future? What are the causes of actions? What are the theories? And how can we spread this out? So the Monk case is filed in Connecticut, which is the Second Circuit. What can be done in the Fourth Circuit? What can be done in the Ninth Circuit? What can be done in Boston? What can be done in California? Because these problems have persisted throughout the entire country, because that was the means of keeping African Americans specifically down, even though they've garnered so much for this country, is how can we delineate and disseminate authority from the Veterans Affairs down to the local level and still deny these people that have earned their rights to their benefits? So how do we test these different court systems? How do we test these different theories until we find something that works? And then once we find something that works, how do we take that to your congressman and say, see, the court has legitimized something you thought was only anecdotal, something you thought was only oral history or stories or the murmurings of the oppressed. We've taken it into this courthouse and we've given it legitimacy and credibility. What are you going to do for us? That's an assumption that we can shift the power of the narrative to say we are worthwhile beyond pandering politically. Our desires, our needs are worth more than a political season. And if you say to us, fine, if you want us to listen to your stories and your harms, it must be legitimized through some sort of tool like the court system, then okay. BVP is here for that. And I believe that this fight is worthwhile because it's not just about veterans. What we win in terms of what veterans get in the future is only a factor of simplicity. Grouping veterans together means you have a tighter cohort, tighter sampling. You have white veterans that served and got what they deserved. You have black veterans that served that did not. But that's the broader story of this country. It's been divided for so long on the basis of race and pedigree. If we can prove that white and black mean something in service where it shouldn't have meant anything at all, well, it might legitimize what most of us in this room already know. That the color of your skin has always in this country decided what you have access to. Take it to court, win. Take it to Congress, win for veterans. Bring it out of those zones, bring it out of those fears and out of those arenas and say, well, if it's true for these veterans, it's true for you and you and you. So what are we going to do next? I greatly appreciate this outlet that has been built for me. It's been cathartic. It's been healthy. It's been a direction that I can pour my energy, my angst, and my anger into. And I welcome all of you to join in this fight with us in an understanding that this isn't just a moral victory. We come to win. And at the end of this road is money, is checks, cash that. At the end of this road are benefits that should have been gotten 40, 50, 60, 70 years. At the end of this road is prosperity, which we've had to wrestle from the hands of our oppressor. And at the end of that victory is more fight. We hand off into the next generation until it's done. May not be here to see it, but I'm happy to be in this struggle with you all. Thank you for your time, and thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate you. So I'd want to emphasize that the Monk case is evolving. It is hopefully slated to move toward class action status next year. What that means is it will be the first class action suit leveraging internal VA data that says that the VA has been engaged in a systemic practice of racial discrimination, and it is giving an opportunity for black vets across the country to join in that suit, right? And so it is imperative that folks in this room understand the gravity of the Monk case and the opportunity that we have as a community to tell this particular story that has been ignored for so long. And I'm just very, very grateful that you all are here to hear this conversation that we're about to have next. So, as far as the work of BVP, continue to follow along on our social channels and on our website in the months ahead. But the conversation that we're about to have is going to be with three brilliant women. Claradith Landry, who can come to the stage, please, and everybody's going to introduce themselves. Sonia Kumar from the Maryland ACLU. Right. And Julia Metcalf. Thank you. Another round of applause for the panelists. So obviously the work of the Black Veterans Project is focused largely on reckoning with the past, but I think that it's always important that we steep our conversations in what's possible for the future. And so I had an opportunity to meet these brilliant women over the course of doing this work, mostly in the last year. I think, Julia, maybe 2 years ago. Time is flying. And Sonia Kumar even more recently, but it feels like we're connected in so many ways to our journey. So first, before we get into the conversation, I wanted to give each of you a moment to introduce yourselves, just what brings you to this conversation.
Okay, I guess I'll kick it off, right? Thank you first and foremost, Richard, for having us. This is truly a very timely conversation. Irrespective of what your political beliefs and affiliations are, this is a time to have this conversation, so it's part of the overall discussion about where we go from here and making sure veterans' voices are heard. My name is Claradith Landry. I'm the founder of the Inclusive Security Collective Initiative. Just to remember it, it's ISCI, so a little bit of a play on being read on, because we do believe that we deserve to get access and to keep access as veterans who have served or part of a larger military family. And speaking of family, I'm fourth-generation military service member. I was an intelligence officer, counterintelligence agent, and commander for 9 years. Had an incredible experience, worked for NATO Partnership for Peace, had an opportunity to travel all across the world, deployed for Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then also had an opportunity to work for the Secretary of the Army as her advisor and special assistant for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that work isn't new to me. I've been a JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion advocate since I was pretty much a child, being raised in a family that was very much involved with the SCLC, with the King family, as well as family members who were part of the Black Panthers in Louisiana. So this whole idea of justice, social justice, racial equity is absolutely not new, but it's more so not just an idea, it's a responsibility. And as far as getting involved in this work, honestly, as much as I tried to get away, it kept pulling me back. I really thought once I took the uniform off, I'd done what I needed to do. But I noticed that you can do even more and have even more pressure and influence when you're on the outside looking in. And you can bring people along with you to bring attention to what areas are still inequitable and what shouldn't be permitted. So being able to do that in my presidential appointment for the Secretary of the Army, focusing on the Base Naming Commission, making sure all of our heroes were recognized, focusing on the inequitable investment in HBCUs for research and development, where 9 schools have to share $90 million over 5 years, where one predominantly white institution gets 10 times that for 1 year. I don't understand how you expect us to be willing to serve, which we are, which we prove time and time again, and not show us the same investment as we do an entire institution. So my company is here to do just that. We focus on legislation, making sure that the National Defense Authorization Act is inclusive of the needs of our community, and it's actually codified through legislative language that we influence. We also focus on professional pathways for up-and-coming Black professionals to identify which STEM areas, which areas of security, which areas of intelligence they might want to be a part of. We also make sure that we have a really big focus on this external outreach. What can we do to have more of this conversation in non-traditional spaces? Are we at the Essences? Are we at the F1s? Are we having conversations on a panel with Earn Your Leisure? Because when you're talking about closing the economic or the wealth gap, defense has the 3rd or 4th largest budget, $1 trillion nearly. So how are we having a conversation at all when we're not talking about the industries and the specific markets that are going to help us close that gap? Okay, if we were willing to serve, then we should be a part of every aspect of it that returns that money right back to us. And lastly, we focus on business identification. What small businesses that are Black-owned, women-owned, Latino-owned, every demographic you can think of, are they a part of the defense industrial complex or the defense industrial base? Again, $1 trillion industry. And if we're not, how do we get them there? How do we make sure that they get ready? And more importantly, how do we make sure that they stay ready?
Okay, I'll try. I'm not of this community, so my name is Sonia Kumar. I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Maryland, and thank you, Richard and the Black Veterans Project and my panelists and all of you for indulging me and allowing me to be part of this conversation. I think I'm really here in part to reflect on how the work of your community and your undertaking connects with sort of this broader movement that Mr. Walker referenced. My work is actually really very much in the criminal legal space, working with people who have been incarcerated for very long periods of time, working with survivors of police violence. There's a young man who died in Maryland, Anton Black, just like George Floyd. We sued on his behalf, got relief for him and his family. But why I'm here today is because of a lawsuit that many of you are aware of that was filed challenging race-conscious admissions at the military academies, in particular at the Naval Academy, and it's part of a much broader, decades-long effort to ensure that we don't have equity to ensure that white supremacy remains sort of both the fact and the law of the land. And so I'm here to do my best to try to sort of share a little bit from the legal context and how that connects, and some of the opportunities that will hopefully exist for you all to participate as the case goes forward.
I got imposter syndrome all of a sudden, so I'll try to keep up. I'm Dr. Julia Metcalf. I am an Air Force veteran intel. No, there's a couple of us. Intel officer for 11 years. My brothers were Marines and Army Special Ops. There we are. Where you at? Yes. My sister is a retired senior NCO for the Army. My nephew is a senior NCO in the Air Force, and my niece is Navy. So when I had the opportunity of meeting Richard 2 years ago, ironically at Navy Federal Credit Union, as I listened to some of the conversations that he talked about, I felt it. I didn't just listen to the words, I felt it. So my background is more of the academic side of the house. I've led diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, military-focused programs for USAA, for Caterpillar, most recently for Navy Federal Credit Union. But one of the roles that I had that I think most pivotal for me earlier on in my military career was recruiting. I recruited military officers for the Air Force, and I did those academy interviews. And there's a saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And when you get up close and personal and look at some of those processes that were created in 1950s, 1960s, you see exactly how someone has a pattern of belief and tells himself a fiction of a story to impact others for generations. So you'll learn about our background and experiences, and we'll give you some examples as we sit here. But I always ask for space and grace when I speak. The stories we're going to tell you are personal to us because they impact the people that we love. We know exactly what it means to see people that we love work their butts off and not get an opportunity that they earned and they deserve just because of the way they look. We know what it means for veterans to be denied life-changing medical services over and over again. Anybody familiar with the VA process? Anybody work for the VA? I apologize in advance. Oh, amen. Amen. Anybody who works for the VA knows it's not the easiest process for us to be able to get access to, especially when there's, thank you. No, it's not. Especially when you have forces working against you actively. So hopefully this is an opportunity for us to recommit to one another that we're going to do the right thing, not just for our generation, because I think you said it, we may not ever live to see it, but there are people that are depending on us to continue to find our voices and speak up until they have voices of their own. So again, I'll ask for space and grace. I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth. It'll be the truth. I cuss a little bit. I apologize. So just going to let y'all know.
Oh, thank you. No, you good.
Sorry.
Everybody has their own mic. Thank you. They're wonderful introductions. Before we get into the conversation too robustly, I also want to thank the allies that are in this room. It is often that, as vets, we can silo ourselves, but often as black folk too, and we can't do this work and move it forward without allies in the room and in the conversation and understanding what we're trying to accomplish. So thank you for taking your Friday evening to be in the room with us. So I want to start by naming an ancestor, Ralph Abernathy. He organized in the 1940s to ensure that black service members had equal access. Black service members had equal access to particular opportunities in the military, but specifically folks that were working in the defense industry. And so we're going to get into a lot of that, but that was the real starting point around coordination and organization that would lead to the civil rights movement, right? That would lead to the ability for black students to really matriculate at the academies. And what we have happening right now, and I'm going to first have the first question go to Sonia, is there's a gentleman by the name of Ed Bloom who has on a rampage, a white billionaire who's been on a quite literally a rampage, trying to deconstruct the gains of 50 to 60 years of social and racial progress in this country. And his latest project is against affirmative action at the academies. So let's explain some of that history and let's get into it.
Yes. So first, I just have to say a little bit of my personal history, which is that my dad's side is Indian, and my dad worked with folks who invited Martin Luther King to India. And one of my favorite photographs of my dad is actually with Ralph Abernathy in India when he was a very young man. But so I mean, I don't think it's a secret to anyone in this room that there's a war on racial justice. It's part of a very long and, a tradition that goes back to the founding of this country. Of any time that there's progress, there's a backlash to that progress. And any time that there's progress, there are voices that say, equity for you means I get less. And that's exactly what Edward Blum's sort of view is. And because he's a billionaire, he can afford to pay people, collect people who may not even represent really the communities that they purport to speak for, to go into court and win cases because our judiciary is also populated by people who don't have the lived experiences of a lot of people in this room, and that's really important. That's important. So I'm glad you went to law school. I hope there are more people here that will consider going to law school and hopefully end up on the court. But the most recent iteration of that was the Supreme Court's, their cases against Harvard and the University of North Carolina, which really resulted in what many of us regard as a sort of devastating set of court opinions saying the law is colorblind. And anything other than colorblind is anything other than colorblind violates the Constitution. And I was saying to my co-panelists that I was rereading some of the language and the opinions to prepare for tonight, and I kept having to stop myself because it is so maddening, completely divorced from reality, so many fictions. And part of what is really grotesque is the way the court kind of invoked the transformative decisions of the Supreme Court in like Brown v. Board to use the language that was about remedying discrimination in favor of sort of arguing against what I think all understand as sort of the claim of reverse discrimination. So in the court's opinion, so the United States had filed a brief before the court saying, the military academies are different. This is a matter of national security for us. And so the court, rather than grapple with that, and it was Justice Roberts who wrote the majority opinion, but there was plenty of complicity across the bench, said, well, in recognition of those distinct interests, this case, these announcements we make today may not apply to those military academies. And so 5 seconds later, Edward Blum was financing the litigation against West Point and the Naval Academy. And the Naval Academy case is the one that has gone sort of forward first. The trial was just concluded in the District Court of Maryland up in Baltimore. I was there for the first, for opening arguments. And I mean, essentially, Students for Fair Admission is very clear that their goal is to eradicate affirmative action in all of its forms. And part of what is so concerning is that the majority of the Supreme Court accepted the idea that basically anything like affirmative action is akin to relying on stereotypes, because if you are working in a race-conscious world or acknowledging that there is any kind of difference of experience based on your race, that is stereotyping what a person of color brings to a classroom. So the current status of the Naval Academy litigation is basically that they made their arguments. They had somebody who purported to be, who said he was, he was a black gentleman who'd been in the Air Force, who had for 40 years never experienced a discriminatory incident in his life. That was my reaction, but you're not allowed to laugh in court. And
roll your eyes.
Yeah, and yes, that happened a lot. And and other announcements, a lot of stuff out there that sort of really feeds into this idea that there are people of color who don't necessarily think that this stuff matters, and it's bullshit, and it's BS. And yeah, thank you. And I bring that up to say, I think part of what is super frustrating is like when we're going in the courts, it's treated as if these are two equal sides, right? And I think part of my ask of this group of people is to tell your stories. Tell your stories everywhere you can. And sometimes you're in those conversations where you're like, I don't know, can I say that here? Say it. Just say it. We have to make it more normal. We have to make it more genuine. And if we don't say it, they don't know, or they can pretend that they didn't know. And I think, and I say that because in a much more concrete way, the next phases of the case is that, so whatever the court decides, somebody is going to appeal, and eventually it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And I hope, if nothing else, that the Supreme Court, and there can be a record of the injustices that your community has experienced, and concretely, and stories, like you talked about your dad in one of our pre-calls, and I think like those kinds of things that really just don't allow us to hide from our history or pretend that it doesn't sort of continue to shape everybody's experiences right now.
If I could add just a little bit of context as someone who's done those academy recruiting interviews with some of those young people. So any given moment, you might have 11,000, 12,000 students apply to go to those academies. Usually there's only about 1,100 slots. I'm looking at the about 1,100 slots. So it's a gambit. All of those kids have 3.5 GPAs or higher. All of them. All of them have done some type of leadership. All of them. But you get a group that has been told that they are number one all their lives, and now they got to compete with other number ones who've been number ones all their lives. It's an interesting conversation to have with them and their parents, because they can't have it by themselves. It's an interesting conversation when they realize they are no longer the top 10%. And what I see as a narrative, I recruited in Missouri for quite a bit. You hear me, you understand, I saw your face. We're in Missouri and Kansas. So when you tell these students they didn't get it, the narrative that they've been told their entire lives that they are number one and they're going to get in, and their parents have reaffirmed it, and their teachers have reaffirmed, even though they were a class of 30, that there's no reason you shouldn't get in. And then they happen to see someone, or they happen to read that out of those 11,500 students that applied, 60 of them, typically 70 there were 70 students who identified as black that got accepted out of 11,500. Take it into perspective. 1,100. Out of 11,000 applicants, out of 11,500 applicants, the Air Force Academy has about a 13, 14% acceptance rate. Navy is even tighter than that. It's 10%. But all of these students find a scenario that justifies that hurt. A lot of it comes from hurt. And their parents like, not my baby. I got many a phone call about my baby. Well, your baby's an adult, I'm not talking to you. Right? But now they've been told, and that's the scenario they want to hear. Right? So they take this core belief that someone they've always been told that is lesser than has taken something from them that should have been theirs. When I can tell you, you've gone through the process. There's nothing easy for any of those students. All of those students earn their slots. So when they talk about the process, you also get your family members, if you're well connected, you get a congressional recommendation. I'm from Mississippi on a farm. My daddy didn't have any congressional friends or anything like that. So when we talk about making that process equitable, we're talking about students who are in a situation where they know where they're going to sleep every night. They have 3 hot meals versus the student who has to work 40 hours plus be a caregiver to their siblings and sometimes their parents. There is no equity in that. So when we have active programs that go out to seek to simply show someone you have an opportunity and a chance to go to college for free. It's going to cost you 5 years, but just to get the opportunity. And you have someone who goes out of their way to invalidate everything you have worked your life for. I think it's simple. I think it's very simple for a lot of those kids. You're no longer number one. And it hurts. And so their answer is to do this. Their answer is to argue. There are 70 cadets right now for the last entering class out of 1,118 that identify as black. That's it. It's dropped significantly since 2022. Even then, it was only 100 plus, 120. So we're not talking about these staggering numbers for diversity, equity, and inclusion that are occurring. And you can guess the number one demographic that's been there for the entire time the academies have existed. So I call BS, I'm not going to say a word, on the arguments that there's this massive movement to become woke and take over this demographic when you've got 70 kids that have earned their slots. 70 out of 11,000.
What are the long-term implications of a diminishment in the kind of matriculation in numbers? I mean, I know that Claradith and I, we be on the phone. Oh, okay. I always think we're going to talk for like 5 minutes, and I'm like, it's been an hour and a half. I got to get off this phone. I don't know how this
solve
happens.
the world's problems.
But we were talking about the fact that the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff benefited from affirmative action existing, and its deconstruction, the long-term implications of that. So, Claradith, can you speak to that?
Absolutely. There is basically a 10-year period, if you talk about the implementation of the program and the impact of the program, where you basically have a long line of, or what we consider at the U.S. Military Academy, the long gray line of black graduates from West Point. In fact, I see some of the very leaders that have graduated from USMA here with us today that are on the Black Veteran Projects Board, from Mary Tobin to so many others. In fact, under Secretary Clifford Alexander, that was the program that essentially, helped get more black cadets to West Point. He had a lot of programs, relationships with black media outlets, from Ebony Magazine to Essence Magazine, to direct some of the marketing funding to their publications so that more advertisements could be run in those magazines to recruit black service members, either enlisted or let them know that there are opportunities at the academies to become officers and what that means. And so from a period of time from, I may be off a couple of years, but I know at least by 74, and I believe Secretary Austin is a graduate of 75, my father's a graduate of 78, but leading all the way to about 1981 and a little after, you had just a long line of black officers graduating from West Point and several other academies. And they all watched out for each other. In fact, being at AUSA recently, the Association of the United States Army annual conference here in D.C., it was almost like a full-blown family reunion. I'm sitting down with Lieutenant General retired Leslie Smith, who is now the Chief Learning and Development Officer for AUSA. Not a graduate of West Point. However, he is actually, I may be mistaken. Point of the matter is they all have a lot of relationships where they've helped each other out, where they've worked together, where they've compared notes. To General Vi, who went to an HBCU, but gladly took a lot of graduates under his wing from different commissioning sources to say, what do you need? We're all, at least in my group, are a part of the ROCKS organization when it comes to mentorship. There's so many other organizations that know that there is a gap to the way that we are developed and the expectations of success or the lack thereof from a lot of these institutions that say, we're going to take you under our wing. We're going to figure out what you need, where the gaps are, so that you can be successful, and going to help identify those barriers ahead of time so that you can be successful. And like I said, this was a real initiative to push more black talent to these institutions because, one, they wouldn't have been aware of it. And secondly, once you get in, does not automatically mean success. Okay? One of the hardest stories I had to listen to was the family of Charles Young, for 100 years trying to get this man his posthumous promotion to one-star general. There have been family members that have been involved. There have been, he was a member of Omega Psi Phi, so you had a lot of the leadership in that particular fraternity who were involved. You had a lot of members of Congress, so on and so forth, for 100 years, saying that the only reason this man was not considered for promotion to a 1-star was because of his race. I don't know how many times I had to look at letters that said the military is just not ready for a black leader. The military or the world and the nation is not ready for a black leader. And the story that I don't mind sharing here that my dad has told me many a times is when not only did you have Undersecretary Clifford Alexander pushing more cadets to the academies or more black talent to these academies, you also realized that there weren't any black officers to train them from the academies because a lot of the instructors, the TACs, the advisors come from said academies. So they brought HBCU TACs and advisors. General Kip Ward and General Larry Ellis were my dad's TACs at West Point. General Ellis went to Morgan State and a proud alumni of the Morgan State. Okay, do not question that man about it. And it is a beautiful thing to see. But when you talk about actually getting to the school and people pouring into you and wanting to see you succeed, that is just simply not the case. You can take it back to General Benno Davis Jr. being stuck in a closet instead of a dorm room, being told not to interact with any of his white peers being told if they're caught speaking to him, they will be expelled. Fast forward to my dad, 1975 through 1978, being excluded from certain things, having his TACs having to go in and fight for him. He was recommended to be in the top 3 leadership. First ever they would have a black man in that position. Let's just say the numbers went up a certain way in the position he was supposed to have. They came back down another. It took General Kip Ward, it took General Larry Ellis to go to the SOUP, to go to the Alumni Association and say, what is this? What is going on? Top grades, plays all of your sports, basketball, football, baseball, considered a leader by all of his peers. What is it that he's missing? Or what is it that he has that's different from everybody else? My dad was the first black deputy cadet commander in the history of West Point in 1978. 2 years later, it was General Brooks, Vincent Brooks, who became the first captain, first captain. To this day, my dad and General Brooks are very, very tight. But again, it wasn't a competition amongst ourselves. It was realizing that we're in this fight together. And if we don't push one another, if we don't help one another, where there's clearly gaps, where there's clearly no one to really help us, we're not going to succeed and we're not going to excel.
Thank you for that. Julia, you told the story when we were on our pre-call about, I believe it was the Tuskegee Airmen.
Yes.
Can you go ahead and tell that story for the audience? And then we'll follow up with the Tuskegee Agreement, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions.
So as Clara was talking about her father and how he excelled in everything, it brought to mind a dear, dear family friend that I knew from the time I was born until he passed away when I was 30 years old. Has anybody ever heard of Colonel Alva Temple? So nobody. Okay. And that'll prove my point in just a second. So Colonel Alva Temple was a Tuskegee Airman. And to put it bluntly, he was the Tuskegee Airman. He was a captain at the time who trained many of the other pilots. He was, as we know, the Tuskegee Airmen were the amazing, never lost a bomber. People wanted to be escorted by them because they were that amazing and talented. Captain Temple at the time was invited along with his own crew to have an air competition for the Army Air Corps at the time. And they brought in pilots from all over. He assembled his group from Tuskegee. It was roughly about a 4-day exercise of all the things fighter pilots do. Whatever that is, I was intel, I can tell you how to blow it up. I can't tell you how to fly it. But they did all of the things. There was air-to-air combat. There were all of the amazing things that we see on TV and in the movies, right? Colonel Temple, Captain Temple at the time, his team led from beginning to end. Every competition, they had antiquated aircraft. They led. They were not given the same opportunity with the amount of training practice because they couldn't train together with the white airmen. Still led. They led the entire event from start to finish. Not even close. Presentation very much like this room. There's a bar. You know, we like to drink in the military. Not saying it's right, not saying it's wrong, but it's there. They have a presentation. The scores are there. The 4 men walk up to receive this gigantic trophy. They announce the winners. Dead silence. Room full of pilots. Room full of leaders. These men have demonstrated without a doubt that they were the baddest thing flying. And they were met with silence. They weren't allowed to take their trophy. The trophy was actually placed in a closet at Wright Air Force Base in Ohio. And it wouldn't be until 2007 when it was found while they were cleaning out that closet that anyone would know that story, that they won and were the first Top Guns for the military. He never talked about it. He owned a gas station. He was my father's best friend. He never talked about it. He never said anything about it. But he left messages about how he loved this country. He left messages about the sacrifice, being spit on, being cursed out, being called the names. He didn't let it deter him. And when I told him, my 21-year-old self, that I was going to the Air Force, he was elated and terrified for me. He was elated and terrified for me. Elated that I was joining the service that he loved so much, that he had given so much of his life for. Terrified because he knew how he was treated. And he said, "Sweetie, it's going to be worse for you because you're a woman." So the Top Gun, when I watch that movie with Tom Cruise, I get mad because that ain't right. Don't nobody up there look like Mr. Temple. But the point is, talent was not enough. Leadership was not enough. Care, concern, and love for the country was not enough for them to simply be recognized. They weren't even allowed to attend their own victory party because they were black. So when I think about why I sit here and why I tear up talking to Richard, I think about that man who didn't get any of the benefits he deserved as the top gun for the military. Why was he not the trainer of all pilots? Why was that team not at the forefront of leadership academies? They weren't. Hidden in the back of a closet in Ohio and wouldn't be known about until after his death by accident. So I told myself, if I ever get a chance to speak, I talk about Mr. Temple, I call Mr. Temple. I didn't know. And I will never be in a room and let it be silent and not have his story and let someone know that they are not valued for who they are and what they bring to the table.
So we're just going to segue right into this idea of the Tuskegee Agreement. And Richard and BVP, thank you so much for giving us all the opportunity to speak to this topic that's so near and dear to us. I had the opportunity to speak at the Democratic Convention about this. At the end of the day, though, this is an agreement that crosses all political lines. This is the opportunity to really execute and actualize a promise that has never been kept. So how many of you are familiar with the book or the idea of the Tuskegee Miracle? By a show of hands? Okay, we've got a few. Really quickly, The Tuskegee Miracle is a book that really captures the relationship and the first meeting and dinner held between President Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington. Out of their relationship birthed what is now known as the Tuskegee Airmen, where there was an agreement to create more black pilots, create an entire flight institute, an entire curriculum that would allow that particular unit to exist. But in return, okay, for our service, for our lives, for our dedication, for our commitment, and in spite of our humanity still not being acknowledged during that entire period, we were supposed to be able to have access to the same benefits as other service members, meaning that we could come home and get home loans. We could come home and use GI Bills. We could come home and have the respect that we worked so diligently for. And instead, we were met with more and more racism, absolute disregard for our service, never being able to actually claim the benefits that we worked so tirelessly for. In fact, I share it with my fellow panelists here. I'm so grateful for the work that you all are doing because without knowing about you all, I had an opportunity to work with my uncle who served in Vietnam War, who just got his benefits in 2013. Okay? So to think that he's just one of many that may not even know where to start. And so the idea of the Inclusive Security Collective Initiative is really about fulfilling the promise that was supposed to be the Tuskegee Miracle, which we're now reframing as the Tuskegee Agreement. We have worked, we have served, we have given tirelessly, and we are asking for the same things that we asked for then, but we know we deserve even more so now. We want access to the same opportunities to be homeowners. We want our businesses to be considered viable and equitable and have an opportunity to actually go after those large defense contracts that will make us a part of the defense industrial complex and base valued at $1 trillion. We want sustainable investments in our academic institutions, where HBCUs are turning out just as many military officers and general officers as the military academies, if not more. So help us understand how we can serve, how we can give our lives, we can give our time, and can prep our babies and our next generation to say it's honorable to serve, and yet still have nothing to show for it within our communities. And we're saying that stops today.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Unfortunately, the panel ran over a little bit because we get to talking. So we won't have any questions, but hopefully we'll continue to engage. I'll say the last word on this is the case for reparative justice for Black vets numbers in the hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And so the work of this project is to unearth how we get that money and how do we get into the hands of the Black veterans and the families that had earned it and hadn't gotten it. And so I'm grateful that everyone is here, but this is a fundraiser. So I know you got some free drinks and some free food, but please, there are codes all around. And for the last 30 minutes, we'll open up the bar and continue to engage with one another and build community. But please, we cannot do this work if we're not resourced. We've been doing it for 6 years. It's been a labor of love by so many Black vets, many of whom that are in this room, but some of whom are not. And for us to keep going, we have to have resources. So please donate to us, tell your friends about us, and continue to plug in and build community with us. We appreciate you and thank you for coming. Yeah.